Have you ever noticed how a 2-year-old will just confidently point to their friend and say something like, I gave him the toy?
Oh, yeah. It seems completely normal, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
They heard an adult say the word gave, they remembered it, and they just repeated it.
But then, a few months later, that exact same toddler will point to the same friend and say, I give him the toy.
Yes, they add that ed to the end. And if you really think about that for a second, it's kind of wild.
It's totally wild because that child has never, not once in their entire life, heard an adult use the word gived.
Right. So they can't possibly just be imitating it.
Exactly. Instead, they've subconsciously identified this highly abstract mathematical rule for the past tense in English,
And they're basically independently running that algorithm on a brand new word.
which is incredible. I mean, they aren't just biological parrots copying sounds. They are like little data scientists.
Which completely shatters that whole illusion that learning a language is just about repeating what we hear.
Right. It hints at this massive hidden machinery that's operating just beneath the surface of our conscious thought.
Well, welcome to today's deep dive. You have provided us with a truly massive stack of research today, spanning, linguistics, neuroscience, cognitive psychology.
It's a lot of ground to cover.
It is. And the mission of this deep dive is to answer a fundamental, almost, existential question.
Which is, how do we actually acquire language?
Exactly. And why do some people seem to just, learn so much faster than others?
It's a mystery that has puzzled philosophers literally since antiquity. And as your sources show, it's currently driving some of the most rigorous cognitive science we have right now.
Because we're trying to understand the actual architecture of human communication. And, the stakes here are incredibly high for anyone listening to this.
Oh, absolutely.
Whether you're like cramming vocabulary for a trip abroad or trying to reconnect with your family's heritage.
Or maybe you're just insanely curious about the wetware inside the human skull.
Right. Understanding how we learn languages can drastically change the way you approach studying. You can basically stop fighting your brain.
And start working with its natural mechanisms. It shifts the paradigm completely.
Yeah, it takes you away from that incredibly frustrating belief of, oh, I'm just inherently bad at learning languages.
And moves you toward, oh, I just haven't been leveraging my specific cognitive architecture correctly.
So here is our roadmap for today. We're going to be exploring the age-old debate of genetics versus environment.
We'll also examine some pretty haunting real-life stories of extreme language isolation.
Yeah, those are intense. And we'll look at what they reveal about the brain's developmental clock. Plus, we're going to debate the real impact of your personality and your genetic makeup on your learning speed.
And finally, we'll extract some highly actionable, science-backed methods that you can use today to basically hack the learning process.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want to start with what the literature universally refers to as the great debate.
The big one.
Right. Is language something wired into our DNA, or is it learned completely from scratch?
Well, to understand the modern science here, we really have to start with the historical baseline. In your sources, we see the behaviorist view.
Which dominated the early to mid-20th century, right?
Exactly. Heavily championed by the psychologist B.F. Skinner. Skinner basically proposed that language is simply a learned behavior.
Governed by the exact same laws of operant conditioning that govern any other animal behavior.
Right.
Let's actually define operant conditioning for a second, just because it's so central to his argument.
Sure. So operant conditioning is associative learning based on consequences.
Meaning, you do something, and depending on what happens next, you either do it more often or less often.
Precisely. Skinner basically viewed the infant brain as a blank slate, a tabula rasa.
So in this framework, a child begins by just making random, undifferentiated noises, right? The babble.
Yeah, there's no linguistic intent at all. But eventually, by pure statistical chance, they happen to make a sound that roughly approximates a word in their parents' language.
Okay, let's say they stumble into the syllables mama.
Right, and the mother immediately reacts. She smiles, she rushes over, she gives the baby intense affection.
Maybe she hands them a bottle or a toy they wanted.
Exactly. So the baby experiences this massive influx of positive reinforcement.
And the brain registers a very simple equation. Emitting this specific sound sequence equals a highly desirable outcome in my environment.
Right, so the behavior is reinforced. And through thousands of these micro-interactions over years, stimulus, response, reinforcement.
The child supposedly builds a complete linguistic repertoire.
That was Skinner's model, yes.
I want to pause right here and actually defend this empiricist view for a moment.
Oh, really? Okay.
Because stepping back from all the complex neuroscience, Skinner's model makes perfect intuitive sense.
It definitely appeals to our common sense.
Right. It appeals to our fundamental understanding of practice and reward. And honestly, it democratizes language.
How so?
Well, it implies that anyone, including you listening right now, can master a complex foreign language if you simply subject yourself to enough flashcards, enough input, and enough positive reinforcement.
I see where you're going with this.
I mean, isn't mastering the subjunctive tense in Spanish mechanically identical to learning to hit a topspin backhand in tennis?
That's an interesting analogy.
Right. I swing the racket 1,000 times, my coach corrects me, I see the ball land in the court, that's my reward, and my neuromuscular system adapts.
Yeah, that makes sense for motor skills.
So why should vocabulary and syntax be immune to that exact mechanism? It's just input, repetition, and reward.
Your defense highlights exactly why behaviorism was the unquestioned scientific consensus for decades. I mean, it feels intensely intuitive to how we experience adult skill acquisition.
Exactly.
But the problem arises when we really scrutinize the mathematical complexity of what the child is actually accomplishing.
Right. The math.
Yeah, and this is where Noam Chomsky entered the fray in 1959 with his really famous critique of Skinner.
Chomsky basically looked at Skinner's blank slate idea and said, the math doesn't add up here.
He argued that Skinner's model was fundamentally incapable of explaining the speed, the accuracy, and the novelty of infant language acquisition.
So what did Chomsky propose instead?
He introduced the nativist counter-argument. He proposed the concept of universal grammar and something he called the language acquisition device, or the LAD.
LAD.
Right.
And his proposition was pretty radical at the time, right?
Extremely radical. He said, we are born with pre-existing, innate biological hardware designed exclusively to process human syntax.
Okay, but if operant conditioning works for, like, teaching a pigeon to play ping pong, why couldn't it work for teaching a child English?
Well,
Why do we need to invent this invisible theoretical hardware in the brain?
the mechanism that necessitates this biological hardware is a concept known as the poverty of the stimulus.
Poverty of the stimulus. What does that mean exactly?
So if you record and analyze the actual real-world linguistic input that adults provide to children, it is remarkably chaotic.
Oh, like it's messed.
Highly degraded. I mean,
Oh.
adults speak in fragments. We stutter. We make false starts. We routinely violate grammatical rules in casual conversation.
Yeah, that's true. We certainly aren't walking around delivering perfectly diagrammed, mathematically precise sentences to toddlers.
Not at all.
We say things like, hey, grab the, no, not that one, the blue thing over by the, yeah, that.
Precisely. The stimulus is impoverished. Yet, from this chaotic, fragmented, imperfect data set, children somehow effortlessly extract highly abstract, complex grammatical rules.
And they achieve this incredibly fast.
Largely without any explicit instruction. I mean, parents rarely sit their 3-year-old down to explain the rules of subject-verb agreement.
Right, they just absorb it.
And if Skinner's purely behaviorist model were correct and children were just biological tape recorders imitating what they hear to get a reward.
They would only repeat the chaotic, broken mess that they receive.
Exactly. But they don't.
Which brings us right back to the toddler acting like a data scientist from the beginning of the show.
Yes, the gived versus gave example.
Right. It proves that the child is operating on internal rules. They recognize the abstract rule for the past tense, adding an ED sound,
Yeah.
and they actively, creatively apply it to a novel situation.
They're overgeneralizing the rule before they've even encountered enough data to learn the irregular exceptions.
They're computing the language, not just copying it.
What's really fascinating here is that the scientific community didn't just stop at this binary choice between Skinner's blank slate and Chomsky's pre-programmed genetic grammar module.
So there's a middle ground.
Yes, the modern synthesis, which is prominently featured in your sources, leans heavily toward emergentism.
Emergentism, like Brian McWhinney's competition model.
Exactly.
How does emergentism bridge that gap between the nurture of behaviorism and the hardwired nature of nativism?
Emergentism suggests that we don't need a magical, dedicated grammar box in our DNA, but we also aren't completely blank slates.
Okay, so what are we?
It suggests language emerges from an intricate dance. It's our general cognitive processes, like our profound capacity for pattern recognition, our working memory, our ability to track statistical probabilities interacting with environmental pressures.
So the human brain has evolved this general, highly powerful processing hardware, and the intense social environment of human interaction basically boots up the software of language.
That's a great way to put it. The neural networks literally compete to process the incoming auditory cues, and the most efficient pathways are strengthened.
Okay, so we have this incredible biologically primed hardware. We have a brain uniquely evolved to recognize linguistic patterns and run statistical models on the sounds we hear.
Yes,
But that incredible capability leads to a very sobering reality, doesn't it?
it does.
Because biological hardware degrades, it changes. Which brings us to a massive question for anyone trying to learn a language as an adult.
Does this biological processor have an expiration date?
Exactly. That takes us directly into one of the most fiercely debated, heavily researched areas in second language acquisition.
The factor of age and the critical period hypothesis.
Let's talk about the ticking clock. The critical period hypothesis was originally proposed by neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield, right?
Yes, and it was later popularized by linguist Eric Lenneberg in the late 60s.
And the theory basically postulates that there is a strict biological window for achieving native-like fluency in any language.
Correct. This window relies heavily on the brain's profound neuroplasticity during the early developmental years.
And according to the strict version of the hypothesis, this window begins to rapidly close right around the onset of puberty.
That's the claim. And the underlying mechanism driving this closure is a process called brain lateralization.
Lateralization, meaning the cognitive functions of the brain are separating and specializing into the left and right hemispheres.
Exactly.
I wanted to try a metaphor here to explain how this mechanism works because it helped me understand it.
Go for it.
Let's imagine the infant brain as an incredibly dense, totally untouched jungle.
Okay, I picture that.
Initially, you have billions of unassigned neurons, and you can bushwhack a pathway absolutely anywhere. You can connect any sound to any meaning.
Because you have high plasticity, you can navigate freely in any direction.
Right. But over the first decade of life, as you learn your native language, your brain realizes it's inefficient to keep bushwhacking all the time.
So it starts to optimize.
Yes, it starts paving the pathways you use the most. It clears the brush, lays down asphalt, and builds these massive superhighways for your native language's specific grammar and pronunciation.
And by the time you hit puberty, lateralization is largely complete. The superhighways are built.
And they are incredibly fast, which is why you speak your native language so effortlessly.
Oh.
But if you try to learn a new language at age 20, you're trying to bushwhack a brand new trail through a jungle that has been heavily pruned, paved over, and structurally cemented.
It's an excellent way to visualize the loss of plasticity. You can still get from point A to point B, but you have to use the existing rigid roads, which is why you might always sound a bit foreign.
The early, strong versions of the critical period hypothesis argued that native-like acquisition past that lateralization point was biologically impossible, didn't they?
They did, but validating this theory presented a massive ethical hurdle.
Well, yeah. I mean, you can't ethically lock a child in a room for 13 years, depriving them of language, just to see what happens to their neural superhighway.
Obviously not. But history, tragically, provides natural experiment.
Right. The research dives deeply into the feral child studies, and the contrast between two specific cases, Jeannie and Isabel, is perhaps the most compelling evidence we have for this biological window.
The case of Jeannie is a profound tragedy, but it's deeply illuminating for cognitive science.
What happened to Jeannie?
Jeannie was a victim of unimaginable abuse. She was isolated in a small room from early infancy until she was discovered by authorities at age 13.
13 years old, so she had been almost entirely deprived of spoken language her entire life.
Yes. And because she was 13, researchers realized she was past the puberty threshold. Her brain had already lateralized.
To use the metaphor, the jungle had been paved, but without any language pathways being built at all.
Exactly. So researchers and linguists immediately recognized this was a unique, albeit tragic, opportunity to test the critical period hypothesis.
So they worked intensively with Jeannie for years, right? Providing her with rich linguistic environments and direct teaching.
They did. And the results were highly specific and deeply revealing. Jeannie successfully developed a relatively large vocabulary.
Okay, so she could learn that the sound apple mapped to the physical object of an apple.
Yes. She could memorize nouns and verbs without too much trouble.
So the window for learning raw vocabulary, simply mapping symbols to objects, was apparently still open.
But she never grasped syntax.
Really? Never?
Never. She never acquired the ability to use grammar. She could not string those memorized words together into meaningful, syntactically correct sentences using function words, prepositions, or tense markers.
Wow. So her communication just remained fragmented.
Yes, just telegraphic strings of vocabulary. And this provided massive support for the idea that while the brain retains the ability to memorize lexical items, the specific biological window for computing grammar had permanently closed.
But then you compare Jeannie's trajectory to Isabel's.
Right. Isabel's circumstances were horrifyingly similar. She was incarcerated in a dark room with her deaf mother, completely isolated from spoken language.
However, the crucial variable here was time.
Yes, Isabel was discovered and rescued at age 6.5.
Okay, so she was still deep inside the critical period window. The neuroplasticity was still high.
And when Isabel was placed into a systematic training program, the difference was just staggering.
Unlike Jeannie, who plateaued early.
Right. Isabel rapidly progressed through the typical stages of language acquisition. Within a matter of months, she was producing complex, grammatically correct sentences.
Because her brain was still plastic enough to build that foundational architecture from scratch.
Exactly. It's heartbreaking to study, but it proves the biological constraint of lateralization so clearly.
However, your sources also detail cases that aren't just about deprivation, but about the brain actively fighting back against bad input.
Yes, the story of Simon is absolutely fascinating.
Tell me about Simon.
Simon's case was documented by Singleton and Newport, and it's a brilliant piece of evidence regarding the resilience of the language acquisition device when it operates within the critical period.
Simon was a deaf child, correct?
Yes, and his parents were also deaf. However, his parents had only learned American Sign Language, ASL, much later in their own lives.
Well past their own critical periods.
Exactly. Because they learned it late, their mastery of ASL was highly flawed. They used incorrect morphological rules, they were inconsistent with their spatial grammar, they dropped markers.
So they were providing highly degraded, messy linguistic input to their child.
And crucially, because of their living situation, they were essentially the sole source of language for Simon.
He wasn't getting corrected by a broader native signing community.
Right. So if we go back to Skinner and the behaviorists for a second.
Simon should have perfectly copied his parents' broken ASL.
Yes. He should have internalized their mistakes as the standard, but he didn't.
Because Simon was a child, his neuroplasticity was at its peak.
His brain took this broken, inconsistent input, analyzed it, and naturally filtered out his parents' errors.
That's amazing. He just constructed a perfectly organized, highly logical, grammatically flawless linguistic system on his own.
For instance, in ASL, verbs have these complex spatial agreements based on the location of objects. His parents constantly mess this up.
But Simon naturally systematized it and used the spatial verbs flawlessly.
His brain demanded grammatical order where the environment provided chaos.
It is a stunning demonstration of emergentism and those internal computational drives.
His brain was biologically mandated to build a systematic grammar, abstracting the rules even when the input was unreliable.
And this drive to compute, to structure, and to communicate complex mental states really highlights something profoundly unique about the human species.
Which brings us to the animal studies.
Right, because scientists have spent decades trying to teach human language to chimpanzees, like the famous Nim Chimpsky or Washoe the chimp.
The animal studies are great because they really clarify the boundary of human cognition. Chimpanzees can absolutely learn signs.
They can learn tokens, they have excellent associative memories.
But they never cross the threshold into true syntax. They do not combine signs to create novel, structurally dependent sentences.
The linguist Herbert Terrace, who led the Nim Chimpsky research, eventually realized a crucial flaw in the chimpanzee's communication.
What did he notice?
Nim was only signing because he wanted a physical, tangible reward. He was essentially a very advanced operant conditioning subject.
He would sign give banana because he wanted the banana.
Exactly. The motivation was entirely instrumental and physical. Humans, conversely, are uniquely driven by an innate desire for joint attention.
We have a deeper intrinsic motivation to share complex mental states.
A human toddler doesn't just point at a dog to get the dog. They point at the dog and look back at you because they want to ensure you are both experiencing the concept of the dog together.
Chimps do not do this.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because if everything we just discussed is true,
If the biological window for grammar and native-like pronunciation strictly closes around puberty,
right, if the neural highways are cemented, what does that mean for adult learners?
that is the million-dollar question.
If you are a 30-year-old trying to learn Japanese or a 50-year-old trying to learn Italian, are you just biologically doomed? Do adult learners simply lack the raw talent for language that children possess?
That perceived lack of talent is the source of endless frustration. If we accept that the neuromuscular plasticity for perfect accent acquisition declines, it forces us to look at the hard science of individual variation among adults.
Because some adults still learn so much faster than others.
Exactly. And this brings us to the intersection of genetics and working memory.
Let's delve into the genetics of talent, because your sources do not shy away from the biological reality that some people are simply born with an advantage.
The research points to actual identifiable genes dictating language proficiency.
Wow, like specific genes.
Yes. Two prominent genes discussed in the literature are FOXP2 and ROBO1.
FOXP2, I think I've heard of that one.
It gained fame because severe mutations in this gene cause profound verbal dyspraxia. That's a drastic inability to coordinate the complex neuromuscular movements required for speech.
But ROBO1 is far more relevant to the average language learner, isn't it?
It is. Variations in the ROBO1 gene are strongly associated with the functional integrity of something called the phonological buffer.
I really want to break down this concept of the phonological buffer because I love the analogy here.
Let's hear it.
Imagine the phonological buffer as an audio clipboard in your brain's short-term memory system.
Okay, an audio clipboard.
When you hear a native speaker utter a fast, complex sentence in a foreign language, those raw sounds are temporarily stored on this audio clipboard.
And your brain then races to process those sounds, analyze the syllable boundaries, and map them to meanings.
Right, so a high-capacity phonological buffer driven by genetic advantages like ROBO1 means your clipboard holds onto those high-fidelity sounds much longer before they fade into static.
And that larger clipboard capacity allows the learner to hear a complex string of foreign syllables, retain the exact acoustic signature, and repeat them back with high accuracy.
And someone with a smaller genetic board capacity hears the same sentence, but the sounds degrade before their working memory can process the pattern,
Leading to slower acquisition and poorer pronunciation.
The sources go even further into the biological determinism here. They note that inherited general intelligence accounts for roughly 60% of the variation in IQ among adults.
And this raw processing power directly impacts spatiomotor skills, writing fluency, and the ability to consciously manipulate complex grammar rules.
It creates an undeniable baseline of cognitive efficiency.
It really does.
Honestly, looking at this data, I feel a strong urge to push back.
Why is that?
Because as someone who loves the idea of lifelong learning, this feels incredibly defeating.
I can understand that.
If 60% of the variation in processing power is just inherited intelligence, and I wasn't lucky enough to inherit the ROBO1 gene for a massive audio clipboard.
And your critical neuroplastic window slammed shut 15 years ago.
Exactly. Then what is the point? If the biology is so heavily stacked against us, why are millions of adults spending time and money on language apps and tutoring? Are we just fighting a losing battle against our own DNA?
The data on genetics is real, but drawing a defeatist conclusion from it is a profound misinterpretation of how adult learning actually functions.
Okay, good, because I was getting worried.
While genetics and age define the baseline parameters of the hardware, they absolutely do not dictate the final outcome of the learner.
So what does?
In fact, when researchers analyze highly successful adult language learners, the focus shifts dramatically away from pure biological determinism and heavily toward the overwhelming transformative impact of sociocultural factors and psychological drive.
Sociocultural factors, meaning your external environment and your internal motivation can actually override your genetic baseline.
Precisely. Let's examine two foundational models from the research: Robert Gardner's socioeducational model and John Schumann's acculturation model.
Okay.
Both of these frameworks introduce critical metrics known as social distance and psychological distance.
Let's define the mechanisms behind those distances. What is social distance?
Social distance measures the degree to which an individual learner is integrated, or desperately desires to be integrated, with the target language community.
Are you isolated from them or are you immersed among them?
Exactly. And psychological distance measures your internal comfort level, your anxiety, and your emotional orientation toward the learning process itself.
So how does this override biology?
Gardner heavily emphasized that possessing deep, intrinsic, integrative motivation, the profound desire to become a functioning, accepted member of the target culture, acts as a massive cognitive amplifier.
Okay, let me try an example. If I am a college student taking a mandatory French credit just to graduate, my motivation is purely instrumental. I just want the grade.
Your psychological distance is massive because you don't truly care about the language?
Right. And my social distance is huge because I don't interact with any French people. So the biological barriers remain high.
Yes. But consider an alternative scenario.
Okay, what if I fall in love with someone from Paris and I move to France and I desperately want to communicate with their grandparents and be accepted into their social circle?
In that case, your motivation becomes highly integrative. Your social and psychological distances shrink to near zero.
And my brain responds biologically to that urgent social necessity.
It does. Maintaining and building new neural pathways in adulthood requires significant metabolic energy. If the brain perceives the language merely as an abstract puzzle, it won't allocate the resources.
But if the brain perceives the language as a vital tool for social survival, belonging, and identity formation,
It prioritizes the metabolic energy to force adaptation, overriding the friction of an older, lateralized brain.
that is fascinating. And that ties directly into what the sources say about the role of personality, which I found so interesting. We always assume that highly extroverted people are naturally better language learners.
It is the most common stereotype for sure, but the empirical reality is far more balanced. Extroversion and introversion simply dictate different pathways to success.
How so?
Well, extroverts absolutely have an advantage in lowering their social distance. They actively seek out interactions. They are far more tolerant of ambiguity.
And they're willing to make massive, embarrassing mistakes in public just to keep a conversation flowing.
Exactly. This guarantees them a massive volume of raw input and speaking practice.
They get the physical reps in, they're throwing themselves into the deep end of the pool. But what about the introverts?
Introverts possess highly distinct cognitive advantages. The research demonstrates that introverts often excel at deploying systematic, highly effective learning strategies.
Because they might be hesitant to speak immediately.
Right. Because they hesitate, they spend more time in the active listening phase, they process the input deeply, meticulously noticing subtle morphological rules and grammatical structures.
So the extrovert is out at the local market, boldly speaking fragmented, grammatically incorrect Spanish with 5 different vendors, maximizing their social interaction.
Yes.
Meanwhile, the introvert is at home, quietly consuming Spanish literature and podcasts, internalizing the exact mechanical structure of the subjunctive tense.
And when the introvert finally does speak, their output is often far more accurate and complex.
Both are successfully acquiring the language, but utilizing entirely different neurological strengths based on their personality profile.
This raises an important question regarding our modern approach to learning, actually.
What's that?
If intrinsic motivations, social integration, and communicative necessity are the primary drivers that allow adults to overcome biological aging, are adult learners failing because their brains are too old? Or are they failing because sitting alone in a room, swiping a screen on a gamified language app, completely strips away the rich, urgent, social survival context that language evolved to serve?
Wow. That cuts right to the bone of the issue. We evolved human language to coordinate hunts, build societies, and prevent ourselves from being exiled from the tribe.
Exactly.
If you remove the tribe, you are trying to activate a biological survival mechanism without any of the survival pressure. The brain just says, why bother?
Precisely. You are trying to start the engine without providing any fuel.
So what does this all mean? We understand the biology, we acknowledge the critical period of lateralization, and we recognize that intense motivation and social necessity can hack our brain's limitations.
So we need practical steps.
Exactly. How do we practically, actively apply this to our daily lives to learn faster? Let's get into the actionable, science-backed methods that anyone listening can use today.
The most powerful practical application comes from the work of developmental psychologist Lev Vyepsky. Specifically, his concept of the zone of proximal development, or the ZPD.
The ZPD sounds incredibly theoretical, but the mechanics of it are entirely practical. Let's break it down.
Vygotsky's sociocultural theory posits that learning is fundamentally a socially mediated process. The zone of proximal development is defined as the specific cognitive space between what a learner can achieve independently and what they can achieve when guided by a more knowledgeable partner.
So, to acquire a language rapidly, Vygotsky argued you must intentionally operate within this zone.
Yes.
Because if I sit alone in my room talking to myself in German, I am operating below the zone. I'm just entrenching my own errors because no one is challenging me.
Correct.
Conversely, if I drop myself into an advanced university lecture on German philosophy, I am operating way above my zone. I understand nothing, my brain gets overwhelmed by the acoustic noise, and I tune out. So the ZPD is that precise sweet spot where I am slightly over my head, stretching my capabilities, but I have a native-speaking tutor or friend providing an anchor.
The crucial mechanism operating inside the ZPD is what the literature calls corrective feedback, specifically prompts and recasts.
Explain the difference and why recasts are so effective.
Well, explicit correction is when someone stops you and says, no, that's the wrong verb conjugation, use this one.
Which kind of breaks the social flow, right? It raises psychological anxiety.
Exactly. A recast is far more elegant. When you make a grammatical error, the advanced speaker naturally repeats your sentence back to you, seamlessly substituting the correct form, maintaining the conversational momentum.
So if I'm practicing English and I say to you, yesterday I run to the store to buy milk, you don't pull out a grammar textbook.
No, I just respond naturally and say, oh, you ran to the store. What kind of milk did you get?
Ah, so you have provided the correct acoustic input, ran, immediately after my error, within a meaningful social context.
Exactly. This gentle juxtaposition forces your brain's pattern recognition software to notice the gap between your interlanguage output and the target language reality.
And it does this without triggering the effective filter of embarrassment.
Exactly.
You mentioned interlanguage, which brings up a huge trap waiting for adult learners. The concept of cross-linguistic influence or language transfer.
This is a major factor.
We assume we are just pouring new vocabulary into our existing brain. But our native first language is constantly, secretly sabotaging and sometimes assisting the new language.
It alters the cognitive processing completely. You are not simply learning a broken version of the target language.
The text gives an incredibly illustrative study involving Czech speakers learning English regarding a phenomenon called number agreement attraction.
That's a great example.
Let's walk through the mechanics of this because it blew my mind.
So number agreement attraction is a processing error that native speakers occasionally make when their working memory is overloaded by complex syntax.
Right. In English, we have basic number agreement. Singular subject, singular verb. The dog runs. Plural subject, plural verb. The dogs run.
Simple enough.
But if we create a complex sentence where a plural noun is physically placed right next to a singular verb, the brain gets confused.
Very simple.
The key to the cabinets are missing. Native English speakers will often accidentally say are because the plural word cabinets exerts an attraction force on the verb, even though the actual subject of the sentence is the singular word key.
Our working memory drops the ball.
Right. It is an illusion of plurality.
Now, crucially, the grammar of the Czech language is structured differently. The native Czech processing system does not fall victim to this specific type of number agreement attraction.
So logically, you would assume that if a native Czech speaker is learning English, they would have an advantage here.
You would think so.
Because their brain isn't wired to make that specific mistake, they should be immune to it in English. But the study detailed in the research revealed the exact opposite.
It did. Advanced Czech speakers learning English still exhibit this exact same working memory failure in English.
Which demonstrates a profound neurological reality. When you learn a second language as an adult, you're not just pasting English words onto Czech grammar rules.
The heavy cognitive load of processing a second language forces the brain to construct a totally unique hybrid linguistic architecture in your mind. This is your interlanguage.
The interlanguage is its own beast. It is susceptible to entirely new processing errors and working memory overloads that don't even exist in your mother tongue.
Exactly.
And because maintaining this new interlanguage architecture requires immense metabolic energy, we have to talk about the terrifying principle of use it or lose it.
The science of attrition.
Yes.
Attrition. Attrition is driven by what we can call the exercise hypothesis. The human brain is a metabolically expensive organ. Building and maintaining complex neural networks for a second language consumes significant resources.
So if you spend years building those pathways, but then you alter your environment and stop using the language,
The brain registers an inefficiency. It evaluates those neural connections, determines they are wasting metabolic calories, and systematically begins to dismantle them.
it literally unpaves the highways to save energy.
It really does.
But the fascinating part is the sequence of the destruction.
Mm.
The research states that attrition happens in the exact reverse order of acquisition. We lose our skills backward.
Yes.
Why does the brain choose to dismantle it in that specific order?
It comes down to the cognitive load required for different tasks. Producing output speaking and writing requires intense, active metabolic effort.
Because you have to retrieve the vocabulary from long-term memory. coordinate the complex neuromuscular motor plans for the mouth, and actively apply abstract syntactic rules in real time.
Receptive skills, on the other hand, listening and reading, rely on passive recognition networks, which are metabolically much cheaper to maintain.
That makes perfect sense. So when a baby learns a language, they build the cheaper recognition networks first. They can understand what you say long before they can physically produce the speech.
Therefore, when attrition sets in, the brain cuts the most expensive programs first. You lose your productive skills. The ability to recall words and physically speak vanishes.
But your receptive skills, your ability to comprehend spoken input, hang on significantly longer because they cost the brain less energy to preserve. This explains an incredibly common phenomenon. You always hear adults say, "I studied Spanish for 5 years in high school. I can't speak a single sentence today, but if I overhear two people talking at a restaurant, I can still generally understand what they're saying."
That is attrition happening in real time. The brain uninstalled the high-cost speaking software but kept the low-cost listening software running in the background.
So if you want to keep the language, you have to force your brain to expend the energy on output.
Exactly.
Let's move to a final highly actionable mechanism for adult learners: leveraging statistical learning. We noted earlier that infants use statistical learning to decode language.
Yes, they sit in their cribs surrounded by a continuous, unbroken wash of sound.
To a baby, a sentence isn't composed of separate words. It's just a long stream of acoustic data. They have no idea where one word ends and the next begins.
But their brains are running a complex background algorithm, meticulously tracking the statistical probability of certain syllables appearing sequentially.
So if the syllable pre is followed by the syllable dd 90% of the time, the brain calculates a high probability that pretty is a bounded unit of word.
They deduce the boundaries through raw exposure, and the critical insight for adults is that we do not lose this pattern recognition software.
We still have it.
Yes. To acquire a language efficiently, adults must deliberately maximize their raw, unstructured auditory input. You must bathe your brain in the acoustic stream of the language.
Even if you don't consciously comprehend the vocabulary yet.
Even then, it allows those subconscious statistical models to calibrate to the new phonetic frequencies.
But there is a massive caveat to this, highlighted by a brand new 2025 study by Kludkova and colleagues regarding the interaction between prosody and orthography.
Yes, this study challenges a very common adult learning strategy.
Right. So prosody refers to the musicality of the language, the rhythm, the intonation, the stress patterns of the spoken syllables.
And orthography is the written text, the letters on the page.
For years, my absolute go-to strategy was to watch foreign films with the foreign language subtitles turned on. I figured if I can read the text while I hear the dialogue, I'm getting double the input. I'm connecting the sound to the spelling instantly.
It seems highly logical, engaging multiple sensory streams simultaneously. But the 2025 study discovered a severe interference effect.
What did they find?
They found that introducing written text orthography too early in the learning process can significantly hamper an adult learner's ability to accurately perceive and acquire the musical prosody of the new language.
Let's explain the mechanism of why reading ruins listening. If I am a native English speaker trying to learn French, my brain has spent decades hardwiring strict pronunciation rules to the Latin alphabet. When I look at a French word written on the screen, my visual cortex processes those letters and instantly, forcefully applies my deeply ingrained English phonetic rules to them.
This top-down visual processing is so dominant that it literally overrides the bottom-up auditory processing. The text hijacks your ears.
Your established orthographic mappings act as a cognitive filter, distorting the raw acoustic data before your statistical learning software can properly analyze it.
You end up hearing what you think you should hear based on the letters, rather than hearing the actual rhythm and prosody of the native speaker.
So, the actionable takeaway here is profound. Sometimes, to effectively learn a new language, adults have to deliberately blind themselves to their old habits.
We have to resist the urge to rely on text as a crutch.
We have to learn to hear the music of the language purely as sound before we ever look at how it's spelled.
Absolutely.
Okay, we have covered an absolutely massive amount of scientific ground today. We have traveled from the tragic isolation of feral children to the molecular genetics of working memory and the cognitive traps of reading subtitles.
It's been quite the journey.
Let's recap it. We are undeniably genetically primed for language. The biological hardware exists. But it is our intense social environment that must flip the switch to boot up the software.
Right.
Well, children clearly possess a fleeting neuroplastic advantage, that unpaved jungle, allowing them to effortlessly soak up native pronunciation and syntax before puberty. Adult learners are far from helpless.
Far from it. Adults possess advanced executive function, superior strategic cognition, the capacity for profound, identity-altering motivation, and the conscious ability to deliberately place themselves into the zone of proximal development. If we connect all of these distinct threads to the bigger picture, it becomes clear that human language is not merely a utility.
It is not just a biological tool we evolved for asking where the nearest water source is.
Language is the fundamental architecture of human socialization. It is how we connect, how we empathize, and how we delineate our in-groups from our out-groups.
When you commit to learning a second language, you are not simply memorizing a new dictionary of terms. You are actively adopting a new operational framework for navigating human relationships.
Exactly.
And that perspective leads me to a final, slightly provocative thought to leave you with, based on the linguist Vivian Cook's concept of multi-competence.
Multi-competence.
Research demonstrates that the moment you begin intensely acquiring a second language, the way you cognitively process and physically pronounce your first language fundamentally and permanently alters in your brain.
That's incredible.
For instance, native French speakers who achieve advanced fluency in English actually begin pronouncing the letter T in their native French slightly differently. The phonetic boundaries shift.
It changes everything.
Your brain does not just cleanly add a second language into a separate, isolated box on the shelf. The two linguistic systems merge, compete, and irreversibly alter one another, creating a new, hybridized cognitive state.
What?
So if the specific language we speak intricately shapes how we express our thoughts, our emotions, and our very identity, and acquiring a new language literally, physically rewires the neural pathways of your mother tongue.
Yeah.
Who are you becoming when you start studying a new language? And are you ever truly the same person you were before you started?
That is a fascinating question.
The cognitive models may not be able to give us a perfectly clean binary picture of where language lives in the brain. The data might remain complex. But perhaps that is because human language isn't a static structure that sets in stone. It's a living current that constantly reshapes the very riverbed it flows through. Keep exploring those currents.